For the first time since the Gulf War, Western and Russian tanks, once built to crush each other in a Cold War showdown, are finally facing off on the battlefield. The result? Once again, a decisive edge in the favor of Western tanks, which showed themselves to not only be superior tank for tank, but better equipped to handle the realities of modern armored warfare. But what makes these tanks so unstoppable? How are they outmaneuvering and outlasting their Russian rivals and sending shockwaves through Putin's ranks? Could this be the turning point that shifts the balance of power in Ukraine's favor? Stick around as we unravel the answers to these game-changing questions. As of August 6, 2024, the Oryx blog confirms that Russia has lost a staggering 3,304 tanks, with 2,258 of these completely destroyed, amounting to a consistent destruction rate of 68% throughout the war. In stark contrast, Ukraine's modern Western tanks are proving to be far more resilient on the battlefield. Ukraine's Soviet-era tanks like the T-64s and T-72s have understandably suffered significant losses given their outdated designs. However, when it comes to Western tanks, the story is entirely different. Of the approximately 91 Leopard tanks Ukraine's deployed, only 18 Leopard 2A4 tanks have been destroyed, just 45% of those that have seen combat. The Abrams tanks tell a similar story. Out of around 25 tanks, only 4 have been destroyed, a mere 36%. These numbers highlight a crucial advantage. Ukraine's Western tanks are not only surviving on the battlefield but are outlasting and outperforming their Russian counterparts. This stark difference in survivability is a testament to a superior design, technology, and strategic doctrine behind Western tanks, factors that are now making a decisive impact in Ukraine's favor. But what happens when these armored giants meet face-to-face on the battlefield? Artillery, drones, and man-portable anti-tank weapons have accounted for a lot of the tank losses on both sides, but tanks cannot be matched in the forward momentum they generate by being able to storm enemy positions and provide protective close-fire support to infantry. When used properly, they can be at the forefront of offensive operations that capture a lot of territory. Tanks supported by infantry, artillery, and air power helped to break the deadlock of trench warfare in World War I, and they've not changed much in this function since. The United States and other Western countries designed their tanks brilliantly to play this role as part of combined arms operations. The US military's experience in Iraq further reinforced the importance of having tanks and infantry closely supporting each other. Dismounted infantry was vital in supporting tanks against ambushes during the War on Terror, especially in urban environments. But tanks didn't just rely on infantry, they evolved to protect them in return. America's Abrams tanks got steadily thicker and more protective turrets since they were introduced in the 1980s. The thicker turrets better protect the tank and its 4-man crew against threats from above, which is common in urban warfare and from modern anti-tank guided missiles. By staying on the battlefield longer, infantry got more support and valuable tank crews were protected. But armor isn't the only advantage. Western tanks also excel in gun mobility, setting them apart. The Abrams, for example, can raise its turret by 60 degrees or lower it by 20. Such mobility ensures that it can fire on a broad array of targets and support infantry in many situations, especially urban combat. In stark contrast, Russian tanks struggle with crippling limitations, leaving them outmatched and desperate to keep up. The main units in its arsenal, the T-72, T-80, and T-90, can only raise their guns to an angle of 14 degrees upward and 6 degrees downward. Such limitations mean they can't match their Western counterparts in range. For example, the T-72's limited elevation puts its gun's maximum effective firing range at about 2 to 3 kilometers. The M1 Abrams can fire up to 4, thanks to the greater flexibility afforded by its gun design. The limited flexibility of the guns on Russian tanks made them easy prey to enemy tanks in the Gulf War and to ambush from infantry in the Chechen Wars. Many tanks were destroyed in places like Grozny at the hands of Chechen rebels armed with RPGs, firing down at the armor from rooftops or upwards from basements. The miserable experience in Grozny revealed that Russian tanks also didn't take hits well. If damaged from even a basic anti-tank weapon like an RPG, there was a high chance that the entire platform would be destroyed, and their valuable crew members with them. The problem was that the Russian tanks did not separate the ammunition compartment from the main body of the vehicle. If they took damage, there was a high chance of a chain reaction in the magazine that would blow the turret off the tank in a jack-in-the-box explosion. The same has been true for Russian tanks in Ukraine on a wide scale. One of the first confirmed examples of a T-90 tank being destroyed in the war came at the hands of a Ukrainian soldier using a Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle. The tank was of the T-90M variant, supposedly one of the world's most advanced main battle tanks. In actuality, the T-90 is a late Soviet derivative of the T-72, combined with certain features from the T-80, but the Carl Gustaf was even older. Although it's seen significant improvements since its introduction, the Carl Gustaf made its debut in 1948. If an RPG or a Carl Gustaf round can prove so devastating to Russian armor, one can expect to see a lot of destroyed tanks at the hands of infantry, which is exactly what has happened. In the few instances in Ukraine where Russian tanks have dared to go head-to-head, the results have been devastatingly familiar, mirroring the defeats in the Gulf War. One of the problems is that Russian tanks like the T-72 need to get relatively close to an enemy tank to ensure their guns have enough power to penetrate the armor. For example, when going against an Abrams, the T-72 must come within 1 kilometer to be confident about its stopping power. This is a dangerous range, especially on a modern battlefield. Russian tanks are also equipped with auto-loaders, which is why they have crews of 3. There's no need for a 4th crew member to load the ammunition into the gun. There are drawbacks to this though. The autoloader actually has a slower rate of fire, and having only 3 men makes repairs more difficult. Western tanks come with crews of 4, including a dedicated loader. These manned loaders are often faster than the Russian autoloaders. The Abrams, for example, can fire 9 rounds per minute compared to the T-72's 8. The presence of a 4th man also makes field maintenance and repair of the tank easier. Although this might seem like a minor difference, it's played out in a big way in Ukraine. At least 890 Russian tanks have been abandoned or captured to this point in the war because they're often poorly maintained in the field. In contrast, 201 Ukrainian tanks have been abandoned or captured. Of the Abrams and Leopard type tanks Ukraine has lost in that way, 19 have been abandoned, but only after suffering severe damage in the field. Ukraine's Soviet-type tanks are more likely to be abandoned on the spot. For example, Ukraine's T-64 tanks are a lot likelier to be abandoned without taking any significant damage, but none of Ukraine's Western tanks listed on Oryx are categorized as being simply abandoned or captured. They're all listed as being damaged and abandoned. The crew of 4 can keep their tanks better repaired and less likely to be abandoned before a firefight than the 3-man Russian tank crews. These problems are built into the Russian tanks because of the philosophical doctrine they were supposed to carry out. Russian generals envisioned large waves of tanks destroying NATO forces through sheer weight of numbers. Therefore, the tanks needed to be cheap and easy to replace. Making them more survivable would have made them more expensive. Quantity was supposed to take precedence over quality. The design originates with the Soviet Union's deep battle doctrine, which emerged after the First World War. The Soviet officers wanted to avoid a repeat of that experience at all costs. The Soviet answer to the pitfalls of trench warfare was to send wave after wave of armored units in a bid to keep the line moving forward. Breakthroughs needed to be exploited in wide and deep offensives for hundreds of kilometers. Inevitable losses taken in this process needed to be quickly replaced. Replaceable losses matter even more when one considers how costly the deep battle doctrine can be. Even when it goes right, many casualties can be expected. The greatest example was the Soviet Union always taking more casualties than Nazi Germany in World War II, even when the Red Army was at its most effective. If a lot of losses can be expected in conducting operations, it made little sense to make the tanks too expensive, especially at a time when the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact satellite states significantly outnumbered their NATO enemies. Russia's T-72, T-80 and T-90 tanks were designed to carry out this doctrine, so all 3 are built on its assumptions. The more archaic tanks in the Russian fleet, like the T-62 and T-54-55, were also based on these premises. Russia was unable to find a way to fix these problems in its existing tanks. Although the deep battle doctrine never changed, Moscow at least noticed some of the problems in the T-72 and its descendants after the Gulf War and the Chechen Wars, so it tried to bring a new tank to its army, the T-14 Armata. In theory, this tank should have solved the issues that plagued the Soviet-era tanks. The Armata has a more flexible gun that can fire at a greater distance. It also offers more protection for its crews. Unlike the older tanks, the Armata keeps its crew in a specialized capsule that's sealed off from the magazine, preventing the turret from getting blown off if it suffers damage. Its new gun also has greater stopping power. These features had NATO officials fearing what would happen if the Russian tanks met their member states' tanks in combat. These fears were exaggerated because Russia's modernization effort turned into a gigantic, decade-long disaster. Russia could never mass-produce these tanks because they were designed around the wrong engine. This engine is a Russian version of the German X-shaped simmering SLA-16 engine. Known as the A-85-3 in Russia, this engine was not designed for a tank. Instead, it was created for compressing oil and for use in gas stations. However, the Russians were attracted to the engine's power and compact size. Although these attributes made it heavier than the traditional Russian tank engine, the trade-off seemed worth it. Unfortunately for Moscow, doing the most basic research would have revealed that this engine did not sell on the international market for a few reasons. It was complicated, and these complications created operating problems. It was also hard to maintain. The Russians thought they would be able to solve these problems over time, but then they made their second and even bigger mistake. They designed the Armata around this engine, rather than designing the engine for the tank. Russian engineers have been trying to fix the problem ever since. Because of its design, the Armata cannot be readjusted to fit Russia's traditional tank engine, the V92S2F. Only about 20 T-14 Armata tanks have ever been produced. Russian factories are incapable of producing them at scale, and they have not played any part in the war. The Armata could have been a formidable threat to the Ukrainian cause. It would have had more range, firepower, and been harder to kill. It would have preserved the lives of more of the Russian tank crews. The Armata's failure means that Russia can only produce more of the same units that have already proven unquestionable, as Ukraine gets more Western tanks. NATO countries designed their tanks around a different doctrine. Knowing that they would be outnumbered in a confrontation with the Soviet Union, they had to make them survivable and lethal. Each NATO tank needed to be worth more than one Russian tank. As a result, they had to provide enhanced protection and keep their crews alive and firing at the enemy for longer. Sealing the ammunition magazine from the crew compartment was only one example of this. Western tanks have more sophisticated armor than their Russian counterparts. The Abrams has armor made of composite materials that includes ceramics and depleted uranium, in addition to the typical metal. An active defense system that responds to and shoots down incoming projectiles and explosive reactive armor add to the tank's defense. In fact, the Abrams has had so many defensive features that the Army brass has begun to worry about its weight, which is currently over 73 tons. The coming M1A3 Abrams will be designed to shed some of this weight without sacrificing the better protection and firepower that have accrued to it. In contrast, Russian tanks have armor that's more basic. The T-90 has the most advanced set of the lot. Called the Contact 5, this armor is a multi-layered composite system. Active defense systems like infrared signals that block the targeting of anti-tank guided missiles are also a part of the defense suite, as are explosive reactive armor panels, when they haven't fallen into the hands of corrupt Russian logistics officers looking to make a quick buck. While an improvement on the T-80 and T-72, the T-90 is still not as protective as the Abrams. The proof might be that 153 T-90 tanks have been documented as losses. 59% of these have been destroyed. That's a lower destruction rate than Russia's tanks as a whole, but it's still far higher than the Abrams and Leopard tanks that have become casualties in Ukraine. Defense is not the T-90 and other Russian tanks' only disadvantage against their Western enemies. Because it came from Cold War expectations that it would be outnumbered, the Abrams is designed to get the first shot against its enemies, which partially explains its longer range and more flexible guns. The newer versions of the Abrams are almost complete redesigns that take this principle much further. The original 105mm gun has long been upgraded to a 120mm weapon with greater range and stopping power. The Pentagon originally planned to donate the latest M1A2 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, but eventually decided to send the older M1A1 models instead because they would be easier to deliver. Although these are not as advanced, they got upgraded and digitized fire control systems in the 2000s. Some of the features include an independent thermal viewer that provides the tank commander with stabilized day and night vision over 360 degrees, automatic sensor scanning, automatic target queuing for the gunner's sight, and backup systems in case these go down. The new fire control system made observation and target acquisition much easier than in the original Abrams. Russia upgraded its tanks to have digital fire control systems too, but only about a quarter of the 2,600 tanks in its operational pre-war battle fleet were modernized with such systems. Ukraine has long blown past the 650 tanks that were updated with modern systems. Most of Russia's best tanks before the war have been destroyed. International sanctions have made it difficult for Russia to create tanks of the same quality as the ones they had before. For the moment, Russia is meeting its baseline needs by importing parts from China through the dual-use loophole in the international sanctions policy. This loophole allows for such imports if technologies serve civilian needs. These Chinese technologies have been found in destroyed Russian equipment, including tanks, replacing earlier French fire control systems. Although they're lower in quality, they are functional enough for Russia to continue its small offensives. In January 2024, the UK Ministry of Defence suggested that Russian industry could produce about 100 new tanks per month, making its losses sustainable at current rates. However, there is a giant loophole in that announcement. Many of these supposedly new tanks are likely older units from the Cold War that Russia is taking out of storage. Russia has long been resorting to supposedly retired T-62 tanks and has lost at least 175 of these units. It's lost at least 95 T-64 tanks too. These units are unlikely to have been thoroughly modernized. They were simply deployed to support Russia's so-called meat tactics. The vast majority of Ukraine's tank fleet remains Soviet-era units. However, the influx of Western tanks means that Ukraine's fleet has steadily gotten more modern, while its rivals has steadily gotten more archaic. In 2023, when they first started to get their hands on Western tanks, Ukrainian crews were full of praise. In every area from speed to protection to firepower, rate of fire, and maneuverability, they were superior. This superiority was proven in the Gulf War, when American Abrams and British Challenger tanks easily defeated the T-72 and T-80 tanks in Iraq's arsenal. Colonel Hamish de Breton Gordon, a former commander of the British Royal Tank Regiment who saw action in that conflict, remarked that the West tanks could take 10 shots from a T-72, while 1 shot from a Western tank would do the job on a Soviet version. Such battles have been rare in Ukraine, but survivability and range matter even more in the era of drones and precision artillery strikes than they did in the Gulf War. The range, networking options, and survivability of the Western tanks means that they have the advantage in this type of war. The casualty figures bear this out. What's coming next in the tank battles of Ukraine? Will more Western tanks arrive soon and coordinate with the newly arrived F-16s for combined air and ground operations? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out Analyzing the Power of Western Tanks in Ukraine, or click this other video instead.